So let's begin with the focus question. I'm mindful you are all coming at this from very different perspectives. Some of you have been lifelong Lutherans. Um, Only Barb has been a member of this congregation for more than 6 or 7 years. So that's right. So you're coming at it from different perspectives. Some of you are ex-Catholics or coming out of other backgrounds. And so what in all of your lives have you seen? The question I put forward was, what is the role of the church beyond individual congregations? Because that's going to be the subject matter of a lot of today. But in your own life now, how much does the work of the wider church, whether it would be the denomination or the church as a whole, how does that affect you in your own faith life, if at all?
I guess for me, the wider church has always been more influential than the congregation.
Mm-hmm.
And by the wider church, I mean the ecumenical church. And that began for me in college when I was part of the ecumenical movement. And the ecumenical movement was far ahead of the not only the congregation, but of my denomination. So when I went to seminary in the 60s, I really felt that I had been exposed to a much wider, both worldwide and ecumenical perspective than I had in my was present in that seminary. So that's for me, the wider church has provided a opportunity for a wider scope.
Yeah. And I think, Merle, I really appreciate that. And frankly, friends, I think that a lot of what Merle experienced was probably not the tail end. I don't want to quite say that, but sort of maybe in some ways you grew up in this context and this sort of the tail end of this sort of thing that really started in the time period we're looking at, right? In that, and we'll be talking a lot about that and this growth of this wider ecumenical justice movement that was well beyond certainly a lot of individual congregations and also even separate denominations. Once again, I'll say, right, like as when Merle was involved in these things as a Lutheran, at the same time there was a survey taken at the seminary where I graduated from, and a majority of people were still in favor of unofficial segregation, like not legally but de facto.
Mm-hmm.
So, what about the rest of y'all? What is the role of the wider church in your faith life?
I think the role of the wider church as a whole, and even in individual churches is to take care of people, regardless of who they are, what they do, what they believe, what color their skin is, that should be what we should be doing. And I feel like the church is really the only hope, that people have. And it almost feels like what we're going through now, it's almost like repetitive of, things that happened many years ago. It's the more that we're reading in the articles that you send, when I read those, I think, well, geez, this could be now. They could be talking about what's happening right now and all the division and, all that's going on right now. And for me, it keeps resonating that, the church has always been, for all of its faults and goodnesses, has always been the driving force behind things that have made improvements in social life. With that being said, though, there's also so much division between different denominations, differences of thought and very strong differences of thought, so there's a schism right there between churches, but I still feel like the church as a whole is the one entity, if you want to call it that, that really can bring us some hope, I guess, because not that I want to get into politics, and I won't, but, politically, like that's, I don't know that that's ever, and I'm, whatever politics you follow, I don't know that either side is ever going to have the answers, so it's almost, the church is the only hope we have, I guess, is the way I see it.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. I really do appreciate that. Big time. What, any other folks? I mean, I know, so, right, Jean, you came from a Catholic background.
Coming from Roman Catholic, I think of water church, I immediately think of the Pope, the water Roman Catholic Church. And it's because the Pope is, of all of the denominations, probably the one figure that is the most outspoken and most, perceived as a leader of the church. And when the Pope comes out with some sort of encyclical or sort of a statement, even, I think that reflects on the wider church.
Mhm.
And I think we'll really look at that. I think everyone listens to that, whether they agree with it or not, or they anything the Pope. I think people do listen to that.
Yeah.
Which was a little disheartening with the statement that he came up with last week.
And that's frankly, in my mind, the ongoing story of the Roman Church, right, is, I think, when they released the encyclical about sort of climate and environment, that really jump-started or built on a lot of already ongoing work in terms of like the green movement in faith communities. But yeah, I mean, I know a lot of folks are just heartbroken right now with the commentary on same gender marriage, So it's,
And surprised. I was surprised in anything because I did think he was going in that direction.
yeah.
Well, I think, the latest comment from the Pope is not a surprise to me. I think the big lacuna in social ethics in the Catholic Church has always been sexuality. But in terms of economics, support of labor, all the kind of progressive, movement since the late 19th century, the Catholic Church has taken leadership far beyond any other part of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the whole question of sexuality has been a complicating issue in the Catholic Church, and I don't expect it's going to be healed anytime soon.
That's a really good point. I'll never forget, because I spent a year interning at the Lutheran advocacy office at the UN, right? And when it was on in economic stuff or anti-AIDS stuff or poverty, whatever, the Catholic Church was like the Protestant Church's biggest, the progressive Protestant Church's biggest ally.
Mhm.
And when it came to stuff around sexuality and gender, they teamed up with like Iran and were our biggest enemy. Yeah, which is just a weird combination. But yeah, anyone else? Well, so Barb, as the person who has the most historical knowledge of Messiah, how has the wider church been reflected, if at all, here, at least until recently?
I think it's been reflective. I get letters from, the bishop and things like that, which is keeping you informed on things. And we're out there fighting for food for the people, setting up a food bank.
Tell me if this sounds right, that, at least when I first came here, I felt like, and I think it's changed a lot, and it probably can change even more, that Messiah for a long time, and I think for some really legitimate historical reasons, was sort of disconnected from at least the
Yes.
Lutheran church. Right?
And what I'm saying is now it seems like we're more connected.
Yeah.
I didn't know how the bigger
Mhm.
picture was. I never knew the bigger picture,
Yeah.
and I'm just probably in the last few years, I've just been learning, about the different, parts of it.
So, anyone else have any other comments on that initial question before we dive into the scriptures?
I think it's the role of the church, be it the ELCA or the broader, to speak up for justice, to set the standard for what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And I think some churches do a better job of that than others. But I'm sure that people, and the ones that I don't think do a good job, think that we don't do a good job, right? Because we're not unconditionally against abortion, or we're not unconditionally against homosexuality or whatever. But I've always said to people, the ELCA's job and the job of the social statements that the ELCA comes up with is to describe what it means to be Lutheran in the ELCA, what it means to be a ELCA Christian. And I don't think any individual congregations really can do justice to that, because you could have 10,000 different views of what it means to be an ELCA Lutheran. So the church has a really big responsibility in setting the tone for how we should all view life and our role in it.
I think that you got to do more through actions, not just talk and statements. I think they're getting more of that through our actions.
That's that, and right. And I think you're beginning to see more. I think that's a common critique of how the wider church, at least in my lifetime, has worked. Like, the statements are really important. I do think they're very important. I sometimes think, not entirely, but it's the role of congregations and then other allies on the ground to, their feet on the ground, right? To their feet in the trenches, to sort of do the action that you have this broad basis of teaching for. And by the way, one thing I really want to emphasize that Steve said too, and we're going to talk a little bit about this. One aspect of today's conversation is talking about how right around in the 1920s, 30s, there really started to be a big split between different types of socially active Christians. And probably since 1980, the one that I do not identify with, that's the, anti-gay, anti-abortion, all these sort of things, has had like the mic for like 40 years. But look, it's worth looking at where that comes from, because some of it comes from a common root of what we're talking about. And it's important to understand it so that hopefully we can change that conversation. Anyone else have any other initial thoughts about the wider church before we dive into the scripture?
I'm aware, just a comment.
Mhm.
If we think about the wider church, I identify with the progressive part of that, but the wider Lutheran church is variegated. And I was, as Steve was, at the 2009 assembly, churchwide assembly, where the policy regarding homosexuality statement was approved, and the policy regarding partnered same gender persons being allowed to participate in ordained ministry was approved. We got immediate feedback at the assembly from Lutheran churches in Africa in opposition to that position. So we need to understand the wider church, even as Lutherans, is pluralistic and not all on the same page.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's super important, because we've been talking mostly about things kind of on the national level. That's sort of the focus of this conversation. But when you get on the global level, things get different, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why I think the Catholic Church, which does operate much more on a global level than, say, the ELCA does, is not as far along as it could be.
Just a quick comment.
Okay, real quick.
In the Anglican tradition, which has a kind of, it's not quite like the Catholic Church, but it does have a kind of central spokesperson in the Archbishop of Canterbury. when Rowan Williams became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he took a more moderating tone regarding issues of gayness and support for those issues, because he was now now he had to work his way in a relationship to the Anglican traditions, much of which was located in the Southern Hemisphere.
Mhm.
So I think the wider church, whatever we call that, it really does have this many facets to it when we look at it in a worldwide perspective and in a broad ecumenical perspective.
Mhm.
Rowan Williams is one of my favorite theologians, but in that position, he was caught as a person that needed to be a spokesperson in some sense to a divided church. And in fact, the Episcopal Church in the USA was censored
Right.
during that period of time for its having gone beyond the Anglican communion.
Yeah. So we're that a little bit of that stuff will be part of our last talk in a lot more detail, but let's turn to the scriptures. And I think actually this Bible verse is very pertinent. So just as a little bit of context here, I like to think when I talk about the Corinthians, right? Paul, this is one of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Think of Corinth. This is very broad brushstroke, but think of Corinth as sort of like the 1920s kind of Great Gatsby sort of thing, right? Sort of nouveau wealth, right? Kind of gaudy, newly rich people. It was a up and coming town, that sort of thing, right? And Paul is very critical of the practices of the one particular practice of the early church in Corinth. Would someone be willing to? I don't know. Is it easy to see? Could someone want me to read it? Does someone want to read? Or I can go for it if it's easiest.
Go ahead.
Okay. And so if you follow along, it's 1 Corinthians 11:17-26. Now, in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. When you come together, it is not really to eat the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper. And one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. What? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. For I have received from the Lord what I also handed to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Any part of that Bible verse sound familiar?
Of course.
What part?
The words of institution.
The words of institution. So we don't think about it because we don't look at the couple verses that come before those, the words of institution. But what is Paul writing? The thing that we begin to write, we take the words of institution. That's like the words of like our communion liturgy, right? What is Paul writing those words in response to in that Bible verse? Like this part. What's this part about?
Maybe I should have read before the This kind of jumps into the middle of something. It must be about something that was in the earlier verses in that chapter.
I mean, a little bit, but just look at it carefully. What seems to be going on here? Like, Paul's not happy. What does it seem like Paul's not happy about? He says it's not the Lord's Supper.
And people are not treated with respect. Now, they're eating, drinking, whatever, and it seems like not including the Lord in it. It's just an eating, drinking together.
Respect, yeah, but it's so that's true. Look at this verse especially. Each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. You can literally imagine this, right? So imagine if we had a meal after church and there were very well-off people and there were very poor people. And instead of like doing a potluck, the really poor people had like, crumbs to eat. And the really well-off people were, pounding glasses of wine and having filet mignon. Right? Like, that's exactly what Jesus, or excuse me, Paul, the words of institution that we say almost pretty much every single Sunday is a corrective towards our human tendency to sort of separate by class, right? To sort of eat and drink amongst folks that look like us, folks that have similar power to us, folks that have similar wealth to us. And it's a typical, I mean, you certainly see this nowadays, right? We've been talking a lot about how America has been divided up amongst caste quite a bit over the last few sessions, right? About different races. But there's you also have to look at it in terms of class too, right? And so every single Sunday when we do the Lord's Supper, there's a lot of things that are going on in Holy Communion, but one of the biggest things is a call, to unity around God's table, no matter who you are, and that goes in every way, right? And there is something, right? There's something about the Lord's Supper that says when you can connect poorer folks and kind of middle class folks and help the vast majority of people realize they have a common interest, something really good can happen in society. And when people feel welcome.
That he was saying that that the Corinthian church wasn't recognizing that we're all the same in God's eyes.
Exactly.
They were kind of glorifying certain people, certain positions, certain groups, certain amounts of money, whatever the case might be, and looking down on or devaluing other, people, groups, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what I feel like the Pope said. That's exactly where my head is at with that. I'm sorry, I was created by God.
Mm-hmm.
So were you, and you're just a man, and I'm just a woman.
Amen.
You're
Amen.
not God.
Amen.
Way too much power. There's always been too much power in the Catholic Church, in my opinion. And I was baptized as a child in the Roman Catholic faith. So
yeah. So that's a big piece of it. So yeah, every single Sunday, it's call to unity, and call to affirm, not just a call to unity, but a corrective to affirm the full humanity. Break bread with that person who's across the table from you, who you might not think is as good as you.
which really, it's so simple, because what it is love one another as I have loved you. Like, that's just it. That's all we need is that. We don't need, I'm not talking about the Bible. I'm just saying it all gets so muddled and cloudy, and, you know, I don't agree with you on this and I agree with you on that. But the bottom line is what we were called to do was to love one another as we have been loved by God. Like that's, you know, as Christ, I mean, that's, we could just hang on to that, but we don't, you know, we're human beings and we don't.
And we'll get to a couple different analyses of that. That's a really good point, Kimlin. Let's, if it's all right, let's transition into some history here now, and then we'll you know, continue teasing out this division separation thing as we're talking about what's going on. So, right. So the last few sessions we were sort of, you know, we sort of started talking about how the social gospel movement sort of grows out of the early industrial, or not, the industrial revolution, right? Fat kids in factories, you know, poor people living in tenements, immigrants, especially, you know, living in abysmal situations, you know, and as well as the end of slavery and the Second Great Awakening, and sort of the early, like that, those early stages of sort of, you know, kind of the civil rights movement in a way, right? You know, when the AME Church is founded, when I can't remember when the founder walks out of the church in Philadelphia, right? And then we were starting to talk, what we were supposed to be talking about last time in a lot more detail and didn't quite get to it, was some more of the initial response to those conditions, right? So you have, so what's going on in like say 1900 to 1915 in America? What do y'all remember from history class, if anything? What's going on during that time period? Like pre-World War I. People are agitating for the right to vote, right? Half of the population, right? So the women's suffrage movement is really gaining strength. The labor movement is really gaining strength, right? You have major unionization drives, and some of them are very violent, and people are killed like a lot. You have so Teddy Roosevelt, some problematic things to who he is too, but does, you know, break up some of the major big corporations like the trusts, right, that were, you know, having a monopoly on the market and you know, kind of driving people into poverty. Taking advantage of all those unskilled workers and, you know, in the stuff, right? And you actually, and you have, dare I say, and you maybe heard a little bit of this when we were talking about Walter Rauschenbusch, who I think we only briefly were able to refer to at all, but you heard Matt refer to this a little bit too. You have socialism become more of a accepted philosophy amongst at least some circles in America. You have, so and I can't remember the guy's name right now, but right, so 100 years ago, 120 years ago, Schenectady was like the up and coming really hip tech city because they had, like, were about electricity, right? Back then, right? And just like, you know, San Francisco today, Schenectady was like, you know, liberal hotbed. Schenectady had the first socialist mayor in New York State, who was the former pastor at First Reformed Church in the Stockade. So, and like, and by when we say socialism in this context, because we'll get into this, right? A lot of times in American society, people that have been wanting to build a more equitable society are labeled socialists, and they're kind of conflated with, you know, Stalin or, you know, Fidel Castro or whoever, you know, which is not the same thing. So you have some of the, and Walter Rauschenbusch, who I think you probably read about last time, even if we didn't get a chance to chat about him that much, you know, is someone that comes out of upstate New York as a pastor in New York City, and puts forward that, you know, Christianity and the social crisis, where he talks about essentially how the Christianization of the world is also about bringing about a more just and economically equitable society in America. And, you know, they're talking about everything from, you know, unions to ending child labor to, you know, all these sort of things. And by the way, not all those things, but like a lot of those things start happening in America. There's a lot of optimism in the early days of the 1900s. And then what happens farther into the teens of the 19th?
World War One.
World War One. Exactly. And then what's the other thing that we never really talked about that much, but we have over the last year that happened at the tail end of World War One?
The pandemic, the flu pandemic.
Yes. So you have these twin things, and there's a third one. What country were on? What country dropped out of World War One early, and why?
Russia, because of the communist revolution.
Yes, exactly. So here's what. So what you have this rising tide of progressive policy, in part, and a lot of times pushed forward by the church, right? And there was a lot of cross section with that Rabbi Mack, referred to a little bit, sort of Jewish organizers as well, along with labor, different types of intersections. But then World War One happens, the pandemic happens, and at the same time, there's the Soviet Revolution in Russia. And what happens is that sort of progressive folks, and you hear the same darn thing in the news today, and you heard the same darn thing in the news in the 1950s. If you're a progressive person, you're labeled a communist or a socialist, and you're evil, and you hate democracy, and yeah. And although it was a lot more vehement, like you could be arrested for it in the teens, and early 20s. So for a little short time period, if you remember that upswing chart, there's a little blip in the upswing around in the 1920s, right? So things kind of get put on pause for a short while. Also in this time period, one thing that kind of, and there's a couple other things that two other dynamics that enter the conversation that are the seeds of a further splitting of the progressive church a few decades down the line. So who remembers about the Scopes monkey trial? That was one of my most favorite interesting things in like AP US history. So the general gist is, and I can't remember what state, I think it was Tennessee. I don't remember.
East Tennessee.
Yeah, Tennessee. So 1925, around there. It's the first time when they want to teach evolution in school, which some say contradicts God's word, right? And it's this big national thing, and it became not about whether or not they were allowed to teach evolution, but it really became about whether or not the church was right, the church, quote unquote, a part of the church, or whether or whether science was true, right? It kind of became a big national. It was the first big national televised trial sort of thing. It wasn't televised in the newspapers, but like the O.J. Simpson trial kind of thing, right? Like this really big deal. There's a guy, William Jennings Bryant, who's arguing in favor of not teaching evolution. And I can't remember the other guy, but
Clarence Darrow.
There you go. Thank you. But short part of the story, it's this big national things, and the more conservative fundamentalists reading the Bible, those folks get humiliated, right? It's clear that science, that a strict reading of Scripture that does not take into account the new things we're learning about God's creation in science, it's clear in a judicial setting that it just won't, they don't win, essentially.
That battle lasted for decades. And
oh, yes.
It's still there, but I say in the part of the Lutheran Church I was a member of during that period of time, 2 campus pastors got into huge trouble for developing some curriculum materials that taught evolution as a component of the teaching of the church, and they were almost expelled. They were almost defrocked for that, and that was the early 1960s.
Right.
So that and of course, creationism in whatever form you fit now is still a massive part of the, I would say, if you took a poll, probably most people that see themselves as believing Christians believe in some form of creationism in this country.
Mhm.
I mean, we taught students in Siena, even Catholic students that didn't not that closely tied to the Bible, but vast majority of them had some kind of creationist view of that when they began their college studies. So that's not something that got over and done with. That's still there.
Well, so yes, you're right. And I would say there's been a resurgence in the last 40 or 50 years in some ways. So
Yeah.
let me tease this out. So this guy here, Harry Emerson Fosdick, a very, and you see the period he lived and worked in, right? He is becomes a very prominent progressive clergy person in New York City, is part of the founding of Riverside Church, which is sort of this kind of center of ecumenical progressive Christian thought in America. He gets into arguments in the 1930s with the same guy who was the Scopes Monkey Trial creationism guy. And you see, right, so there was these two groups that used to be on the same political side of a lot of things, right? The folks that were working to bring about progressive change in terms of, a lot of the issues we've been talking about, they start to get separated by this how to interpret the Bible thing a little bit, not completely, and it doesn't really happen for decades down the line but it becomes a bigger thing. Also, another thing that happens is part of the progressive movement, which we don't think of as progressive now, was prohibition, right? And part of that comes out of the fact that prohibition was seen by many early Christian reformers as like a kind of almost like a women's rights thing, right?
Sure.
When in a context when only the guy is working, and the guy goes and drinks away the family savings and then comes home and beats everyone up, like that's where that grows out of. But then they realize quite quickly in the early Depression, a few years later, right, that also that kind of conservative idea of morality gets repealed too. And so what happens is that there's right around the 1930s, there's a very big chunk of especially the white Christian church in America, but really everyone, that begins to pull itself away from politics, national politics. And there are the folks that are believing creationism and the folks that that grow into sort of anti-LGBT folks, that sort of segment of society, they're very big. They don't go away, but they sort of leave the national public conversation to a certain extent for a few decades. They come back in force in the 70s. And then they become, beginning in the 80s and 90s, the dominant voice in Christianity, unfortunately, from my perspective. Probably, hopefully, everyone's perspective. So that's a piece of the negative part of what happens in this period. Let's pause there. Any questions? And these are, I'm pointing in very broad brushstrokes, right? Like very broad brushstrokes. Any thoughts on that?
And the other, and it's related is, I think probably the other development was the early 1920s, the publication of the fundamentals.
Yes.
Fundamentalism as a kind of articulated set of doctrines that are required believing for those that are going to be orthodox, became firmly articulated.
Yeah, that's a really important. It comes out of Princeton, I believe. There's this book that comes out, called The Fundamentals of the Christian Faith, I think, or something like that. That's where the word fundamentalism comes from, that Merle's saying. And it comes out with a really good intent, sort of, right? To make this, right, we are trying to Christianize all of society, We are trying to build a more equitable, just society in line with Jesus's message. Here are the simple precepts that you should follow to do that. Except it didn't take into account all the new things we were learning about science and looking at the Bible as a historical document. And they sort of stayed there, right? It's how you get the Salvation Army, right, is incredibly progressive on coming out of they came out of the late 1800s, right? Incredibly progressive on race, and they were and even on gender on women's rights to a certain extent, but they stop there, right? Because they don't take into account kind of in the beginning of the 1920s, evolution, science, looking at the Bible from a historical perspective, and that's why they're still super anti-LGBTQIA to this day, even though they would have been thought of as the progressive movement in the late 1800s.
I think they only didn't take into account, they were reading opposition to it.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
So you begin to see this splintering, right, of some aspects of the church that comes back to haunt us beginning in the 70s, especially beginning in the 70s and 80s. But we'll get to that more in the next two times. Another thing that's important to mention is that people like Walter Rauschenbusch in the early 1900s, right? It was a time of intense optimism, right? We can Christianize the world. We can in some way bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And that's really nice. And that's important. And that it's important to inspire people. But that message begins to not ring as true if you've just experienced World War I and the pandemic. And then fast forward a few years and you see pictures of the Holocaust. Right? And so while there's so much that's so good about that early social gospel movement, a lot of critics would say, and I know someone else we're going to talk about that Merle has met in real life in just a second, would say, look, we can bring about progressive change and it's so important, but we also need to take into account the power of sin and the power of evil, because that's real too. And we don't keep both in mind without the other. We're going to miss something. So so we're in, I forgot to bring one book to my little pile of books that I need to show you. Sorry about that. So, it's the Roaring 20s. It's kind of a little bit of a backslide in terms of the progressive movement a bit, but on the other hand, other things are moving forward in positive ways. And then the stock market crashes in 1929. And right. And we understand this a little bit better now than anyone else in our lifetime because of similar things that have come up in the last year. But right, with half of people out of work, I could not commend this book to you more highly. If you went to Ecumenical Advocacy Day, you heard her speak, but Alison Collis Green, No Depression in Heaven. And it's a historical book, and it's about how even in the rural South around Memphis, rural white and rural Black churches work together to bring about the reforms of the New Deal era. And so, right, FDR comes in, he repeals prohibition. All these major giant government work, the Works Progress Administration that, builds national and state parks and highways and, well, not highways, that's a little bit later, but roads and all sorts of stuff all around America. People are put back to work, and artists are employed to create beautiful art and learn, and learn all sorts of things. You see the most massive ramp up in kind of government intervention in the economy ever. The one area, and part of it, a lot of it came out of, the people that grew up in the early social gospel movement, like, so Frances Perkins. Does anyone know who Frances Perkins is? You of us? So she's the first female secretary of a department in the country, right? And she was a secretary of labor under FDR, and she grew up and came out of that early social gospel movement. I think she hung out with like Jane Addams in like Hull House, which was sort of a house of hospitality and support for poor folks that we were supposed to talk about last time. And that's influential. There's a few things though that the New Deal misses. So right, a lot of the money that is getting pushed out to people in all sorts of different government programs gets put under local control, which means the racist people that are in charge of racist, especially systemically racist parts of the country, do not distribute that equitably. Another thing that's happening right around this time, right? So who here, we've learned a lot, I think a lot of people have learned a lot more about this recently, but the Great Migration. Anyone? So so the Great Migration takes place from 1910 to 1970, roughly. And you have to remember, up until 1910, 90% of Black Americans lived in the rural South, right? But amidst Jim Crow and horrific conditions and lynching and all that segregation, by the time you get to 1970 or 1980, 80%, 6 million people move north, predominantly north, or at least to cities. And right, those networks in those small rural Black churches that had been there, they're kind of broken apart. They're transformed in northern cities, but it changes the social fabric that you're working in, right? So that's another big thing that's happening around that time. And so so in part, while the New Deal did lift everyone's boat quite a bit, it disproportionately lifted white folks' boats, right? The GI Bill is another major thing, right? A lot of, so my grandparents' age people, right, could, dad went to college just on the GI Bill, pretty much free, but it was pretty much often usually excluded people of color. Right, home ownership, right? There's all sorts of benefits if you're a vet for home ownership, but we've learned about redlining and these sort of things that prevented people of color from owning homes in places, parts of cities where a lot of value could be built in your house, right? So you have this interesting period where there is churches and labor unions, especially those two groups, working together to bring about massive social and positive social change, but it's disproportionately building a white middle class, disproportionately so. Once again, these are all, you could have a whole semester class on any one of these decades. This is like very broad brushstrokes, but super important. So then I want us to touch on at least, three more figures or stories that come out of this period that are specifically related to the church. So one is a guy that Merle met in real life. That guy. Who's seen that picture before? Reinhold Niebuhr. Right. So he starts his career in sort of the, not communist, but I'd say socialist camp and pacifist camp in the 1920s and 30s. But in reaction to another theologian named Karl Barth, but he teaches at Union Seminary. He starts off, he grows a very small congregation of working folks in Detroit into a major congregation of working folks in the Ford factories, talking a lot about unions and that sort of stuff. But by the time you get to the early post-war period and through the 1930s, he begins to realize, yes, we can bring about progressive change, but it's not like this utopian sort of vision sort of thing. It's rather, like, human sin is real. We need to take it seriously. or else we're gonna, we're not gonna push things forward in a way that will last. I think it's a more realistic view of humanity. Merle, do you want to take another minute or two to just comment a little more on sort of that framing of Reinhold Niebuhr's idea of progressivism?
Yeah. I mean, early on, Niebuhr left graduate school at Yale without a PhD, and went to a parish in the parish in outside Detroit, cut his eye teeth by opposing Henry Ford, and was called to Union Seminary in a kind of practical theology position over against the wishes of the faculty, and in his early writings was Marxist, basically an analysis of the situation that we're facing in this country. So he was very strongly a socialist, and then he did as you suggested, a kind of conversion to what he called Christian realism, and became a famous theologian because he gave the major series of lectures at Edinburgh University, and then became the kind of voice of a kind of so-called neo-orthodoxy, with a strong emphasis upon the limitations of human possibilities and the reality of social sin in this country. So he became the most powerful voice for articulating a Christian perspective that was widely listened to by persons of power in this country.
Yes.
People like Hubert Humphrey was a very close friend of Niebuhr's, and several of the
This picture.
Supreme Court justices, and how he was, until he had a stroke in the 1950s, he probably, had a couple hundred lectures a year, beyond his teaching in the seminary. So it was a very dynamo kind of person.
Mhm.
And I met him in the 70s, or I should say late 60s, and he had suffered from a stroke and was a small fragment of himself, but still was a very powerful voice
Yeah.
at that period of time, teaching a graduate seminar at Union Seminary.
Yeah. So Niebuhr represents this thing that grows out of that progressive movement. So thank you, Merle, for that. That's perfect. And this is, folks like Niebuhr really represent the pinnacle of sort of the progressive but not radical church's power in the 1950s and 60s. So right here you see, so there's a building that's called jokingly called the God Box in New York City, that's right near in the same neighborhood as Union Seminary where Niebuhr was, the same area as Riverside Church. And it's essentially, it's the ecumenical center where most major denominations had their national offices until the last 20 years or so. This is President Eisenhower, laying the cornerstone of that building, right? And so you see that what started in the early 1900s grows into a progressive, a pretty good, making positive changes happening, but not quite as radical articulation of the gospel. And so really so that's, by the way, that's the same, that kind of follows the same pattern as the Federal Council of Churches, which becomes the National Council of Churches, which is still a major organization today. But all the major denominations, Lutherans were pretty good at this, but somewhat wishy-washy in some of the more progressive stuff. But right, like the Presbyterians, your Episcopals, your Reformed Church, your Lutherans, all of them begin working more together ecumenically, and oftentimes lockstep with sort of moderate progressives in power to build to improve society, maybe not in a radical way, but in a steady way, right? That upswing keeps happening, right, as part of this movement. So that's a piece of what comes out of this period. It's not, and like, so right at when you look at Sunday schools at the height of their prestige, right? You got 100 kids, right? It's sort of to raise kids into this sort of Christianity that has this sort of broad, sort of mildly progressive, I think you could say, like civics focus, right? There's a picture of a poster from the 30s or 40s that my friend has in his church where he's a pastor, and it says help your child learn civics, go to Sunday school. And there's a lot of really positive stuff in this, absolutely. And I think, Niebuhr, I think, is probably fairly accurate to say, hey, we need to take into account sin too. We can't just, want to inspire people, but we also need to be real, right, about issues in the world and that there is evil, right? So it's kind of this back and forth, give and take sort of thing. That's kind of what becomes kind of in some ways a little more, and this is why I had that reading from Corinthians. In some ways that becomes more of an elite-ish, in some instances, answer to how to bring about social change in America. That is still progressive, that's still certainly Christian, but is not the only voice in the mix. I'm going to play a short video that there's two videos that describe two other really important kind of threads of what this looks like. Pull it up. And we have not told nearly enough stories about major women reformers, and so we're going to start that here. And I would love to actually do a whole nother class just on Dorothy Day at some point, but.
In many ways, Dorothy Day was a typical grandmother.
I see my grandmother as someone who was very ordinary, but also very extraordinary. I mean, I understood that she was different.
Different because Dorothy Day was so often on the front lines, protesting war and nuclear buildup, creating houses of hospitality for the hungry and homeless, and earning her place on the FBI watch list as a dangerous American.
Yeah, Dorothy Day is a big troublemaker.
As a young journalist, Dorothy Day campaigned for those in need.
Her work keeps putting her front and center in the social movements of the time.
She wrote about workers' rights, child labor. She was attracted to communism, believing it was a way to improve people's lives. All part of a chapter in her own life that would leave its scars. But with the birth of her daughter, Dorothy
Sorry, my computer's freaking out.
Day turned from communism and converted to the Catholic faith. There, she discovered a path that for nearly a half century led her to become one of the greatest champions for the poor America has ever known.
She thought if communism was radical, why shouldn't Christianity be radical? This is radical.
My grandmother always said that she never meant to start houses of hospitality. She never meant to open up soup lines. But what happens when you start writing about these things, people show up at the door.
She wanted the people to exercise their own sense of personal responsibility. You see something that needs to be done, you do it.
But accepting the biblical challenge to be peacemakers also compelled her to become a pacifist without compromise, to use her Catholic worker movement and the newspaper she founded to resist America's intervention in any war. Many believed her behavior was un-American.
She did describe herself as an anarchist.
There's an anarchist dimension to her Christian witness.
Some of the most profound and most rewarding demonstrations that culminated in arrests were with the Catholic worker community. I think of Dorothy Day as a firecracker that never goes out.
Now this grandmother and anarchist may well be declared a saint.
We'd love to see Dorothy made a saint.
For both American middle-class people and for Catholics, they recognized that something extraordinary was going on. They weren't quite sure what to do with it.
She annoyed people because she challenged them.
She was
Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be written off that easily.
I think if you take the Lord's words, you'll find they're pretty rigorous. The Sermon on the Mount may be read with great enjoyment, but when it comes to practicing it, it really is an examination of conscience to see how far we go.
So the article I sent you about Dorothy Day, I don't know who had a chance to read it, but it's actually written by a friend of mine who I went to seminary with for a year before she transferred out, Casey Sepp. And I thought at some point, bringing her for a presentation along with watching that movie on Dorothy Day could be a really interesting thing. But so that's a different slant on sort of the social gospel, right? It's not working with the president as much to bring about legislation. It's this kind of grittier, it is a little of that, but it's also on the ground, grittier organizing in poor communities amongst workers in kind of some symbiosis with the labor movement, and is kind of an interesting voice, and something that, I would love to pick up, the threads on a little bit more. Any quick comments on that before I do one more little video?
I think it's important to be aware that the communist movement was a very progressive, fairly widespread movement during that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, people like Reinhold Niebuhr and Hubert Humphrey became adamant oppositions of that, and it kind of shaped the rest of their lives. It's kind of anti-communism, but communism was a pretty widespread progressive movement, and you found it in Minnesota and various very progressive locations across the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what state had the most registered communists in the 1930s?
I'm guessing New York. I don't know.
Nope. Oklahoma.
Okay.
Right. So this far left wing movement back then, it wasn't sort of it was the opposite. It wasn't an academic sort of coastal elite thing. It was like ordinary folks sort of thing. More so. It was both, but in different strains of it. But like out of this time where like literally people did not have enough to help each other, right? So in No Depression in Heaven, Alison Cullis Green talks about there was this, I guess, survey of like clergy across America in the 1930s. 1/3 of them described themselves as socialists in the 1930s. 1/3 of clergy.
Merle, can I ask you a question? Why? I mean, I don't know a lot about communism. I guess I'm sitting here thinking, well, why was there so much pushback to that? Like, what was threatening to people about communism? When I read this Dorothy Day thing, I thought, communist? Wait a minute, like.
So she doesn't stay a communist either.
Right.
So it's complicated. So what you have in most forms of communism, there's a very like anti-religious thing in general. And that comes out of from the idea that religion is just supposed to placate people and sort of say, oh, just sit tight, you'll go to heaven someday, right? That's where it grows out of that. Which, by the way, is sometimes what religion has done. Right, so sometimes that's legitimate critique, right? The religion is the opiate of the masses, right? Karl Marx says. And the way, to be frank, right, the way it plays out in the Soviet Union, that's a dictatorship, right? A very brutal dictatorship. Like, people don't want that, and I think very legitimately. And I think, third, now this is the one where the red baiting, and you see this every day in the news today, right? Is that really, really well off folks don't want to have some of their money taken away, right? So you have a confluence of, in my mind, very legitimate critiques of communism with, but other forms, right? So democratic socialism, right? The idea there is that you want to not just allow people to vote and have a say in who's in office, but also have a say over the companies they work in a democratic way, right? Or have a right of more if the public owns, more of, so say, right, like So if everyone owned the internet infrastructure, do you think Spectrum would be such a pain in the butt all the time? Right? So right, the line between communism and socialism is not neat, but that's very broad. But I don't know if you want to add anything else, Merle, but and then the last thing I would say too is, so you have this rise in left-wing fervor, right, in the 1930s again. But then what happens in a few years after World War II? You have another Red Scare because the Soviets dropped, test the bomb. And then you have McCarthyism. That's a big push, begins to be a pushback against that. And all of these folks that we're talking about now were all targeted by McCarthy. Or the vast majority of them, to a certain different extents.
I mean, it's important to say that there were communist Christians, and still are today.
Yep.
In other parts of the world.
Ibrahim's one.
So it never totally disappeared. In fact, I think there's still a Communist Party, some parts of the USA where one can register as a Communist Party. And one of my colleagues from Concordia College would have conversations in Europe dealing with various aspects of Christianity and dialogue, and some of that dialogue with Christianity and communism. So I think it's not a dead horse, even though it took a particular turn in certain locations, and many people see it as a continuation of early primitive Christianity.
Right, Acts 1 or Acts 2, right? They hold all things in common.
Yeah.
I'm not, and by the way, I wouldn't call myself a communist. That's not what I'm putting forward. But there's no way that you don't see some economic reflect. I don't think Jesus really would have framed himself in a modern, to say he would fit one political party or one economic philosophy seems inaccurate, right? Jesus was for, I think what you were saying earlier, Kimberly, right, was treating everyone equally and making sure everyone could live abundantly, right? Like, so some of these things get mapped onto modern economic ideas in different ways, right?
See, I never realized that communism, that was part of the, I don't know if it's a philosophy, I guess, because all I remember as a kid was a thing where movie stars were like charged to be communists. And I have vague memories of seeing this stuff on the news, and that communism was always associated with Russia, and Russia was bad. And so communism was bad. So when I read some of this, I thought, well, wait a minute. My only point of reference for communism is that it's bad. It's a bad thing.
Right.
I just didn't have a good understanding of it, I guess.
And I think it's so.
McCarthy's intervention, and painting it with that broad brush became a huge part of that anti-communist move.
And as you get a little bit later, right, Nixon Southern strategy, that's what we're talking about 2 sessions, well, a little bit next session and 2 sessions about, right, a reaction against sort of the protests and anti-war movement of the 60s and all that, so we're getting a little more into historical memory for y'all now, which will be, I'm interested because I wasn't alive then. But so here's one thing that I've always found really interesting. So that same group with Reinhold Niebuhr, there's actually a Lutheran named Frederick Nolde, who is instrumental in founding the United Nations. So they built, right, all these, this was the post-war, building the institutions, and the church was central at building these really good institutions. Nolde as a Lutheran is someone who puts, that you have freedom of religion in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I can't remember the exact name, but at the UN, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that pretty much everyone is signed on to. But then you have these two supporting documents, one that talks more about political rights, one that talks more about economic rights. The USSR, the Soviet Union, signs on to the one about economic rights. The US signs on to the one about political rights. Neither sign on to both.
But Europe does, right? European countries. Yeah.
But in terms of that I would say that, you know, my very not alive then perspective is that the whole Cold War was fighting over two really good and two really bad ideas on each side. You know, right? Like, why can't we have freedom in both? You know, is my thought. And I think that has a lot more to do with Jesus' teachings, right? Like, than either of these poles, that like this hyper capitalist with no economic freedom, or this hyper communist with no political freedom, right? Like, we want to get there, I think.
I mean, we're inheritors of John Locke's notion of democracy rather than Rousseau's. In some sense, you know, liberty over equality is I think is a strong way of saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And liberty means protected against the encroachment of institutions against you.
Right. Yeah. Which I think we've seen in a lot of ways has not worked out perfectly well. Although we do want freedom, and we want to be able to vote, and we want to be able to have, but I think the answer is democracy in all those realms of life, right? And that's a corrective, and that's neither communist nor capitalist. So going back to the Catholics, right? Their economic teaching is not communism, but communitarianism, which is sort of like some of the freedom of a democratic society, the political freedom of a democratic society with the economic freedom of a socialist society. And that's also very broad brushstrokes, and there's a lot more detail we could get into with that. I want us to finish with one more video, but I just need to text someone a link. 1 second here for the thing I need to do at 4 p.m. And that is because this next one provides us with a very good segue into what we'll be talking about next week. If I can find the darn thing. Yeah. By the way, I'm hoping to go to this place on my sabbatical that it's talking about here.
What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that Washington never told a lie. I learned that soldiers seldom die. I learned that everybody's free. That's what the teacher said to me, and that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school.
What if there was a school where you could learn to change the world? That's not a line from a sappy protest song, not a bumper sticker you'd see right next to "I break for unicorns." That was the very real dream of a man some called the hillbilly intellectual and others the hillbilly radical, Miles Horton. That dream's official name today is the Highlander Research and Education Center, but everybody calls it the Highlander School, and it's been changing the world since 1932. One of Highlander's first students, Henry Thomas, described it best. The most important thing people ever learned from Highlander, he said, was how we could help ourselves. The dream began in Horton's dissatisfaction with the education profession he'd chosen. It seemed like ordinary people couldn't learn anything about their own lives and problems. All they studied was how other people lived, mostly people in high and distant places. If poor folks could learn about their own lives, gather together to study their own problems, maybe they could figure out how to solve them. Maybe they could learn how to make those lives better. Highlander moved its energies toward the nascent civil rights movement. The whole world knows that in 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give her bus seat to a white man, as then required by Alabama law. What's less well known is that 6 months earlier, she attended Highlander. It didn't give her the idea. She already had that. What it did do was show her that there were white people as angry about racism as she was. At Highlander, she said later, I found out for the first time in my adult life that this could be a unified society. Again, seeking common solutions for common problems, Highlander created citizenship schools where poor blacks could learn how to pass the literacy tests that Southern states used to keep them from voting. The director for that was Septima Clark, who became known as the grandmother of the civil rights movement and who understood Horton's crazy dream better than most. I have a great belief, she said, that whenever there is chaos, it creates wonderful thinking. I consider chaos a gift. It was in the civil rights struggle that Highlander became most famous, and famous for a song. How that happened is a textbook example of Highlander working exactly the way it was designed. From the start, the civil rights movement had songs, lots of songs, but it didn't have a song. One unifying and irresistible anthem that not only said who they were, but that musically expressed all their hope, determination, and spirit. Septima Clark, Pete Seeger, and a new young staffer named Guy Carawan began adapting an old hymn-turned-labor song that Zilphia loved to sing. The word will was changed to shall. Some verses were fitted to the new movement's goals, and the tempo was changed so people could march to it better. It became We Shall Overcome.
We shall overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome. No, I join hands so often with students and others behind jail bars singing it. We shall overcome. Sometimes we've had tears in our eyes when we joined together to sing it, but we still decided to sing it. We shall overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome.
A lot of fuss has been made over the years about exactly who changed what, but in the most elemental way, this was Miles Horton's dream incarnate, a community coming together to identify a common problem and solve it together. We Shall Overcome was carved from the honest wood of tradition, tempered for years in poor churches and angry picket lines, refitted for the next people's movement and taken out into the world singer to singer, march to march, jail cell to jail cell, cause to cause, from Birmingham to Belgrade, Tiananmen Square to Tripoli. It belongs to the people because that's who created it. Who gave the world its best known Changing the World song? Why, a school for changing the world did. A school named Highlander.
What did you learn?
So, by the way, Miles Horton, the founder of the Highlander Folk School, was a student at Union Seminary of Reinhold Niebuhr's. Right? And it's at that intersection, when the church can be at the intersection of caste and class and help folks of color and poor and middle class white folks realize that their interest is in common against just a few people that want to divide them to keep all the money and power. That is when the most social change happens. And that, I think, is at the heart of Jesus's gospel movement and his articulation of what the kingdom of God is about. By the way, Kimberly, I know you're on the task force. When I think of our community center, a big piece of it I think about is the Highlander Folk School. You can tell Pete to look it up too. But so so this social gospel movement, like MLK and Rosa Parks, they don't just come out of nowhere. They come out of this thing that started way back late 1800s in some ways, early 1900s in another way. And in some ways, so next class we'll be talking about that peak of the upswing of that time of MLK, kind of right before, right after. And then we'll see what the heck happens during Holy Week.
I've never even heard of this Highlander school before.
I hadn't until a few years ago either. Yeah.
Who did they say rewrote the We Shall Overcome song? Did I hear Pete Seeger in there? Or...
Yep. Yeah, Pete Seeger was there. Yeah. So you have this weird intersection of like socialist folk musicians and civil rights leaders and like far left social gospel church people hanging out in the mountains in Tennessee, essentially. And it still exists. And I definitely want
Amazing.
to. They've gotten very involved with the environmental movement in the years since, for sure, and many other things too. I got to get.
I'd like to do some research on them and some of their programs and their philosophy and some of those kinds of things. Maybe.
I think that would be really, really good. I also have Niall Horton's autobiography, if that's ever something to look at. I read it a couple of years ago. It's really great. Yeah. Well, friends, I hope this was a helpful and drawed some interesting connections and a little more cohesive than our last conversation.
No, this was great. I don't know about anybody else, but I feel like, how did I miss all this stuff growing up? Like, where was I?
I mean, I went to seminary and I didn't
remember any of this.
Right.
We'll probably get into this next time, but you saw it on the sign. Highlander School was perceived by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as a hotbed of communism.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so, all these people were under the scrutiny of the FBI during that period of time. The FBI was no friend of civil rights in the 60s.
Amen.
Mhm.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn off the recording, but go in peace, friends, and have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Everybody.